But the first question that we wanted all of us to wrestle with is this question. Actually, we wanted to talk about this. Hold on. This is a well-oiled machine. So, is the question of why do we TPR? Right. This, and just sort of to frame it where I'm coming from.
Can you just talk louder because there's outside? Oh my gosh.
Get down the hall.
Like obstructed view seats. Like
yeah,
is that cheaper than your tickets? All right. I will try to talk louder to people I cannot see. But the first thing we wanted to do is really get all of us thinking about under what circumstances courts should ever TPR. Right? As a field, we want us to wrestle with that question. So here's what we want to do just to get the conversation going. We're not going to spend a ton of time doing this, but we want folks to take about 1 minute on your own and jot down your answer to this question. Because I think as a field, this is the type of conversation that we're sort of eager to hear what we as family defenders think. Under what circumstances should we terminate or a court terminate parental rights? Just take 1 minute quickly and jot it down. Go.
I don't know how they. If you're talking to someone else, you've jumped the gun. Promise you will have time for that. Don't be disobedient yet. We'll kick you out. There are people waiting.
But we'll never get out.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's so true.
That'll take the whole hour. Got about another 20 seconds.
You don't really need to, Josh.
All right, so now if you can physically turn to the person sitting next to you, turn to the person sitting next to you. You can get 1 minute, really quick, just to share what you wrote down about when parental rights should be terminated.
Yeah. Okay. I'm like,
I put when the parents want to stop lots of non-accidental fight.
how they're like, why do we TPR? And I'm like, I certainly would never TPR. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. But
like, when does the government have the right to change genealogy?
Yeah, no,
it's a birthright.
Yeah, gross.
Except I am an adopted parent. I adopted my kids from Russia. So I have to say, well, I guess that's a good thing.
It puts you kind of in a, like, okay, interesting position to be.
But I would have been okay just having custody of them.
Right.
I mean, they had no, you know, because I've asked them before, do you want to go find your parents?
Right.
You know, so
yeah.
We didn't have to end that birthright.
Right. It's like, well,
I wanted to help parent them because they had no parents.
Right. Well, if I were to adopt, I'd be like, open adoption. I'm not like I don't know.
But what we're going to do is really quickly hear some of the things that you talked about. So under what circumstance? Really quick.
Never.
Yep.
When there's no functional family member.
When there's no functional family member. Okay.
Safe haven baby.
So tell me a little bit more about it.
So if a parent, mom gives birth and then surrenders her child to the department to a safe haven location, and that's what she wants, and it's sure.
What else? Yeah.
I just said no, because I think all of the examples that come are when they're on an adoption. Why do we need a termination for adoption?
Right.
We don't.
Right.
That's the way it is, but it doesn't have to.
Okay, so there's a vote for never. Anyone want to push back on the never? Yes.
Sexual abuse, the offending parent.
Sexual abuse, the offending parent. Okay. What else?
If both parents attempted to murder the child and there are no family members.
All right, so both parents murdered the child. And
Attempted murder, they probably
Let's just do one more. Sorry.
The father shot the mother in front of the children, and he's imprisoned her.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it's almost like giving a little more teeth to this. What we mean by what a functional family is. Like some of you are sort of gravitating towards the extreme sexual abuse, murder, sort of abandonment situations where there's nobody who can take care of the child. Chris.
So Vivek, myself, and Emma all represent parents in some different contexts. You can see those contexts in our bio, but we've been sort of grappling with this question, and what the three of us agree on is that we TPR too much as a field. We TPR.
Wow, that was easy. We can go home now.
We TPR too fast.
Yep.
As a field. We TPR when we don't need to, and that TPR is kind of a big deal. It's an important sort of area. And when I'm a data guy, and when I look at the data and see the landscape of TPRs, to me it feels like the Wild Wild West. And it's just this sort of chaotic environment that isn't as tightly controlled from a quantitative standpoint as we'd like to see. So then we get on these calls and we have this sort of group think where we start saying those same things over and over again. They're like, yeah, we TPR too much, we TPR too fast. And we ask that same question to ourselves. And what we can agree on is how much is too much. What we can agree on is how fast is too fast, and what we can't agree on are the precisions of when we need to. And that's what really prompted us to sort of have this conversation and come to the ABA and try and get some more thinking that's really critical and precise on this issue. So that's our landscape today. We've already dove in, we heard a little bit. I think a lot of the folks that commented would agree with these first sort of principles, but then we've got to kind of narrow that and really figure out if and when there's an appropriate role for this idea of terminating parental rights in a trial where the parent and everyone is a formal party. So we're going to get it kicked off with Emma talking a little bit about her thinking around what she calls the 5 Ps, and I'm just going to try and get out of the way awkwardly.
Yeah, so I'm a parent attorney in Atlanta, Georgia. And terminations are obviously like the end of the road. It's something that keeps me up at night. It stresses me. I think what happens is any case basically is potentially a termination case, right? Like that just a passage of time is enough for it to become a termination case. And so when you talk to other people in the field, they'll always be like, well, kids need a permanent and safe, like loving family forever and whatever. So I think that in thinking about this, that there are some underlying motivations that we don't, especially as trial lawyers and on the front lines, that there are other issues going on and other motivations that are pushing other stakeholders quickly towards termination. And so like when I was initially thinking about this, I came up with the pithy 5 Ps, but they're not exact. They don't always like fit perfectly, but as you can see, financial is like a silent P. Profit. Okay, profit. Oh, that's excellent. Right, so we're like working together to come up with new Ps. So it's also like something that, but it's like a way to kind of think about it, like acronyms, like for all y'all law students in here, like how to remember things. And child welfare like loves terrible acronyms. So the first one is permanent. I think there's like this idea that terminations are permanent and they're infallible, and like kids are kind of like frozen in time. We terminate on a 9-month-old and that child is never going to grow up and never have issues, and this is like a perfect, loving, happy family, and we're frozen in time. So I think like the first idea, which is not correct, is that, as I think like the data will bear out, is that these terminations are permanent. The second is that there's state financial motivations in pursuing termination. And as a trial lawyer, it's really hard to think about how to talk about that in the context of a case, right? That's like advocacy outside of the courtroom, but it's also like how do we tell that story in the courtroom? Because it makes people really uncomfortable that the state is terminating parental rights because of a financial incentive. But we need to start to figure out how to tell that story, or we're missing that opportunity. And I'll just say that in Georgia, this idea grew out of the fact that they were terminating, the policy was that children 14 years of age and younger, they could only be reunified or terminated. So there's that idea. And then passive problem solving both on the macro and micro level. So what I mean by that is like there are some really big issues we're dealing with like as a nation, like poverty as a nation. That's a big problem that we need to start to work on in order to avoid this. But we're not doing it, right? We're like addressing it in these like, you know, do a parental fitness evaluation because that'll help you get housing. Like, no, but that's more the micro, right? So that's like in any case, I think a lot of times we get these hard cases and we're like, oh, we're not really sure what's going on here. You know, it's not a murder case or a sexual abuse case, like which I think we'll get back to. But, you know, it's like we're not really solving the problem in the case or like as a nation. My other idea was that the idea that we have a very traditional view of family, that the state is channeling families, channeling children into like what we identify as like acceptable family structures. So that is, I mean, I think it speaks for itself. And then obviously punitive, that we are punishing parents for being involved in the system and for not fixing these problems quickly and on our timeline. And then just like thinking more about this, I was kind of like extrapolating, and I'm like not feeling great, so I went down like a NyQuil rabbit hole, but I came up with projects before. But I think that there's a way in which we want these kids to be more successful citizens, and one way to do that is by placing them in more successful homes. So like ensuring, the state has an interest in families, right? Clearly. So making sure that our citizens are productive. And how do we do that? We take children from unproductive, undesirable families and put them in families that are identified as more desirable and more productive. We privilege this family structure, the adoption family structure, as the ideal family. Like every child needs a mom and a dad, or every child needs whatever, the legally identified parent. And I think it's also like the privilege of people in the system being able to say, I saved this child. No, I saved them. I have the privilege of saving a child. And then lastly, the idea that it goes in with saving but protecting. So I think that is like my nice little fat, 8 Ps.
So I met Emma in Ann Arbor. We used to actually work in Atlanta and didn't know each other, but by the time we were in Michigan, I had moved to South Carolina. And I heard her sort of give these 5 Ps, and I was like, I can totally back up so much of what you're saying. And we started like collaborating and thinking about all this great stuff we were going to do, and then we just went back to our lives and never did it, and here we are again. But one of the things that I want to talk about is the narrative that when I look at the data, I find that is incredibly troubling to me in terms of this idea of how much and why and who we terminate on. So to do that, I want to start with what I'm calling a case study on Arizona, just to sort of whet our appetite and like get a little bit of a sense of like, is there a narrative here? And I'm not picking on Arizona because I can pick on any state, but like I just went with Arizona. No one's killing it. So just some like basic foundational information. 3,400 legal orphans in care on September 30th, 2017. When I say legal orphan, I mean both parents' rights have been terminated. So this child is what we call legally free for adoption, right? They're waiting for adoption in the Children's Bureau's language. Bad language, or whatever. What does that mean in terms of like per capita, right? Like what does that mean in terms of like relative to their size, how much? And it's quite a bit. 20.9 per 10,000 children. That's the seventh most across states. And it's more than double the national rate. So they are TPRing a lot of kids. Why? Because they're adopting a lot of kids, right? They do a ton of adoptions. They do the second most adoptions per capita across states. It's 26.1 per 10,000 children, which you don't have to know what that number means, except that it's more than triple the national rate. So they do a lot of adoptions. They're probably proud of that, right? There's probably some... Okay,
and they get trophies.
Right, so they probably give awards for that, right? So this is our landscape. Lots of TPRs and lots of adoptions. And so then we start to unpack, well, what else do we know? It's hard to read that because the formatting got messed. Half of those adoptions are done by when a adoptive parent is a relative. At least one of the adoptive parents is a relative. So 49% in 2017, you can sort of back up and see adoptions are done by a relative. So there's this idea that we are literally destroying a family, reissuing a birth certificate, reissuing a social security number for the purpose of recreating that family under the auspices of state law. So a lot of relative adoptions in Arizona. What was more surprising to me, and this is a little bit more difficult to understand, is okay, so we're having relatives adopt. Who else is adopting? And I looked at this idea of like preserving a child's race or ethnicity. So how often are black children, non-white, and census data language, right, like non-white, non-Hispanic children being adopted by at least one caretaker of that same sort of racial or ethnic background? AI, American Indian, right? How often are some of these children being adopted by the same non-white, non-American Indian? That would be our proxy for the black non-Hispanic children. There could be other races in there, but primarily we put them in these 3 buckets, and that makes them distinct. Black and white children, Arizona is very good at preserving that racial and ethnic background on those children, but look at the American Indian. Those adoptions, we're, again, destroying these families, and they're either being adopted by their family or someone of the same race unless they're American Indian, Alaska Native. Which is a troubling narrative. Arizona has one of the cleanest statutes across all states in terms of jurisdiction over tribal children. A lot of states are a lot more wonky, so it's actually clear to see that this shouldn't be happening as much. We shouldn't have jurisdiction over these children. Nonetheless, I don't know where I'm going. I keep like walking. I'm a mover, sorry. So in my mind, I get this narrative. We TPR a lot of children. We adopt a lot of children, we being the Arizona. We TPR a lot of children. We adopt a lot of children. We do that for the sake of, by and large, having at least half of those adopted into the same family, or more often, preserving that child's race or ethnicity, except when you're Alaskan Native or American Indian. And that got me thinking more nationally, like what's the landscape? How often are we TPRing children just to have a relative adopt them? And at least 1 out of every 3 finalized adoptions in our nation in 2017 involved a relative as the adoptive parent. So 1 out of those 3 adoptions we're finalizing were, again, destroying the family from a legal standpoint and then recreating that familial relationship. Variance across the states are really high. There's states where more than half of those adoptions involved a relative, and that's Arkansas, that's Florida, that's Indiana, that's Kansas, where there's more than half. It was as low as 2% places like my home state of South Carolina, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Massachusetts, and Alabama. Although, say if you believe that data, Arizona's got some oceanfront property to sell you. We're just not tracking it here. That's the point of that. I truly believe that these data are we're just not tracking the relationship between the adoptive parent and the caretaker. And that's not uncommon. We have data quality issues all over the place. This is what concerns me. This doesn't concern me. This concerns me more. When we know about it, it's really high.
Does that include adoptions that have nothing to do with dependency?
No, these are public adoptions, and these kids are in foster care. These are only foster care kids.
So when you say it's 1/3 nationally, that takes into account these
yeah, so we're undercounting. Yeah,
so
yeah, that's a good point.
Probably.
It's higher, yeah. I don't know how much higher. I mean, so what's interesting is like South Carolina and Alabama in particular don't do a ton of adoptions. Florida does. Like Florida does a lot of adoptions generally. So per capita, these are smaller states anyway in the adoption landscape. Rhode Island doesn't probably do a ton of adoptions. They're smaller.
Yes, we do.
Well, but relative. Like population-wise, you're like numbers. You're the equivalent of like 3 counties in California. Yeah.
If you had our stats, you would be floored.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying like adding these into their true rates wouldn't probably dramatically affect that, but that's probably coming up elsewhere too. So. One of the issues with these data is they're really hard to put together. So there is a way to do it, but you've got to link a bunch of files that are pesky. Anyway, that's that narrative there. And so this got us sort of thinking about, well, what else do the data say about how quickly, who, and what we TPR? So I want to walk through a little bit of that. So the first thing I want to explore is how fast we TPR. So how quickly we get to TPR. And whenever we measure, I don't know if any of you have ever been subject to one of my data presentations, but I'm obsessed with these survival curves. And anytime we talk about timeliness, I really struggle with talking about like aggregate stats, like percent permanent within 12 months, percent permanent within 24 months. I want a more individualized narrative to the story. And to talk that way, I have to use these survival curves. That's what they do. They reveal a more individualized, less aggregate narrative to the data. All about measuring time to some event, so it's perfect for our exercise here. And we're really looking for the points in the curve where there are these sort of drastic changes. So to explain them just in a real quick nutshell, I used an avalanche survival curve. So survival curves are huge in public health, measuring time to death usually. That's where they get their name, survival, how long you survive. And we talk about at the point of some intervention, so we start at time 0, and then time goes on and on. So once you're exposed to the event, that's this axis here. And then as we go up, that's the percent of folks that have survived. So when you